Lesson 62. The verbs volo and nolo, conditional sentences, Caesar, Book 1, Chapter 7, concluded. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 185. We're going to talk a little bit about the verbs volo and nolo, which I think we've talked about in the past, maybe just in passing, perhaps not in a very organized way. But the main thing we need to discuss in this lesson is conditionals, in the sense of conditional sentences. So we'll get to that in a moment. So let's take a look at section 486. I've mentioned to you before the concept that verbs that are very common and tend to get used all the time, my observation is that those are the verbs that tend to be most irregular. For some reason, verbs that are just used all the time, they get contracted, they get mixed with other words. And so, as human beings, one of the most common things that we say is the things that we want or the things that we don't want. So, I want this, I want that, I don't want this, I don't want that. Those are extremely common statements that people make all the time. And so in Latin, the verbs that do that are irregular. So let's turn to the appendix in the back of the book, section 42 of the appendix, and let's take a closer look at these verbs. We won't take too long to do it, but we should at least just look at the paradigm and make some observations. Section 42 of the appendix is on page 279. So let's take a quick look. And just as many other Latin textbooks, the authors of this book have grouped volo and nolo together along with another verb, which is malo. Malo means to prefer. So why do these verbs mean what they mean? Well, volo is related to the word voluntas. Voluntas, that's where we get our English word volunteer and voluntary. It means will, as in what you want. So that root word, vol, in Latin, has to do with your will, what you want to happen. Volo means I want. Vis is second person singular, that's you want. Volt is third person singular. And actually, Volt is more of an archaic spelling. Really, in later Latin, it's V-U-L-T, Volt. Remember that Julius Caesar is writing in the 50s BC. Much of the classical Latin literature that we think of as being from the Golden Age is a bit later. Authors like Ovid or Virgil. The idea with the Golden Age of Latin literature is that it's the age during which Augustus was emperor. So Octavian, the adopted nephew of Caesar, Julius Caesar, had a big war with Mark Antony. They fought over who would be in charge of Rome. Octavian won at the Battle of Actium. And so that's how we get ancient Rome, in a nutshell, going from republic to empire. There's a lot more to it than that. But anyway, from the time when Octavian starts to rule as the sole person in charge of the Roman Empire, that is the big cheese, the head honcho, we call that the beginning of the Roman Empire. And so he is called Augustus, referred to as the first emperor. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm just giving you a broad outline. So during the reign of Augustus as the first emperor of Rome, that is typically what is thought of as being the golden age of Latin literature. You get delightful writers like Ovid and Virgil writing beautiful poems, and many people think of that as sort of the apex of Latin literature. Once Augustus dies in AD 14, people who study Latin literature refer to that as the Silver Age. It's supposed to be an age that was not as good as the Golden Age of Augustan literature. And so if you back up before the Golden Age, that is the Augustan age. Even moving back to the 50s, when you have people like Julius Caesar writing, also Lucretius, and also Cicero. Even as famous as Cicero is, even as integral as his writings were to the development of the language, my old professors used to view him as really pre-Golden Age. They would view him as a previous stage of the language, not like archaic Latin, but just not quite into that Golden Age era. And one manifestation of that is that those older writers would use forms like you see here, like wolt. If you see a text that says wolt, that's a sign that it's from before the Golden Age. Later authors would write that as V-U-L-T, wolt. So the paradigm really is wolo, vis, wolt. But in this textbook, they've got wolt, presumably because this is a little bit before the Golden Age. This is slightly older Latin from the 50s BC. Remember that book 1 happens in 58 BC. So that would be at least 70 years before the death of Augustus. So we do have a pretty good space of time between this and, say, the height of the career of a poet like Ovid. Okay, so there are different periods of Latin literature. Here in this period, we're a little bit before the Augustan age, and so we have this slightly older form of the third-person singular form of wolo, which is wolt instead of the later walt. So that's just something for you to keep in your back pocket there. And then wolomus would be we want. Woltus would be y'all want, if you're talking to more than one person. In later Latin, that would be woltus. And then volunt means they want. In the imperfect, volebam, I was wanting. With volam as a future tense, it's starting to look like a third conjugation verb, isn't it? Voloi for perfect tense, that's I wanted, and so on and so forth. So that's a quick introduction to the verb volo. If you turn the page, you'll see subjunctive forms like velem. The imperfect subjunctive is velem, V-E-L-L-E-M, which we will see, I believe, in our text today, in our reading from Caesar's Gallic Wars. I'm not sure about that, but I think we will see some kind of subjunctive form of volo as we study conditional clauses. Let's talk about nolo a minute. Why is nolo the way it is? How did it get that way? Well, I think that it's really just volo plus the word non. Non volo. If you say non volo over and over and over, those two words can get squished together and turn into nolo. And in fact, in some forms of nolo, non and volo, the two words, are still separate. For example, in the second person singular, non vis. In the third person singular, non wolt. Of course, in the Golden Age, that would be wolt, non wolt, with a U. In the first person plural, they've been squished together. Non volomus has turned into nolumus. And then second person plural, y'all do not want, would be non voltus. In later Latin, it would be non voltus with a U. And then nolunt means they do not want. Moving on to malo. Why do we have malo as that particular spelling? Well, from what I've been told, it's the word magis, M-A-G-I-S, which means more or rather, plus volo. So if you say magis volo, that means I would rather want, or I want rather, or I want more, blah, 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 in the sense of I prefer that other thing. So from the way it's been explained to me, malo, mawis, mawolt, malumus, it's just the word magis, which means more or rather, squished together with various forms of volo. So malo, I prefer. Mawis, you prefer. Mawolt, he, she, or it prefers. In later Latin, that would be ma vult with a U, and so on and so forth. So these three verbs are somewhat similar, and that's why most textbooks present them together, as this book does. So volo, nolo, malo, three good verbs to know about, especially if you want to do spoken Latin. If you want to try to have conversations with people, these verbs become extremely useful. And furthermore, if you do speak Latin and use these words, that's a great way to get used to them. If you use these words over and over, you get used to them much more quickly than if you just see them occasionally in texts. And it gives you much more of an intimacy and familiarity with the language to actually use these words in conversations. So yet again, spoken Latin presents a huge, enormous opportunity for leveling up your Latin skills. Before we go, let's take a look at the principal parts. For volo, we have volo, vele, volui. Vele is the present infinitive. So in our study of conditionals in this lesson, we might see imperfect subjunctives. We might see vele plus endings, velet, velem, things like that. Keep that in mind as we move along. For nolo, we have nolo, nole, noloui. And for malo, we have malo, male, maloi. Again, I think the reason these are so similar is because they're all based upon the verb volo, with just small changes for mixing in or squishing in other words like non or magus. One last quick note before we go. Turn to page 280, that's the next page, and look at where it says imperative. In Latin, if you want to tell someone to do something, you can use the imperative. But if you want to tell someone not to do something, what you do is you use the imperative of the verb nolo plus an infinitive. So if you want to tell someone walk, if you want to say, hey, you, walk, you would say ambula. If it's more than one person that you're telling to walk, you would say ambulate. But if you want to tell someone not to walk, you don't put non and say non ambula. That's not correct Latin grammar. The way you're supposed to do it is literally say don't want to walk. Not very intuitive for an English speaker, but that's how you do it. So take a look at the present imperative of nolo. So if you see one person and you want to say to that person, don't walk, you'd say noli ambulare, which means don't want to walk. And if you have several people that you're talking to and you want to issue a command to them to not walk, you would use the plural of noli, which is nolite. Nolite ambulare. Don't walk. So an imperative for issuing a command to someone, a direct command, for that you just use a regular imperative. But to tell someone to not do something, you have to say noli or nolite plus an infinitive. That's just a quick side note for you as we take a look at these very common verbs. Let's go back to our lesson now. Let's take a look at section 487. They're telling us here that verbs like volo, nolo, and so on and so forth, they can take a complementary infinitive. Or they can have an accusative plus infinitive kind of construction. So number one, voluit means he, she, or it wanted. That's perfect tense. And then we have the infinitive venire, which means to come. So number one says, he wanted to come, she wanted to come, or it wanted to come. They've got it translated here as he wished to come, but we're not sure that it's a he. Voluit doesn't tell us that. It could be he, she, or it. Voluit is not a gendered verb, so it doesn't have a participle as part of it, so there's no way to know the gender of the person saying it. In number two, Germanos in Gallia esse noluerunt. Noluerunt is a form of nolo. It's perfect tense, third person plural. So it says, they did not want. We don't know who the they is. There's no explicitly stated subject. It's just they. And then we have an accusative plus infinitive construction. Germanos is the subject accusative, and esse is the verb. What we have so far is they did not want the Germans to be. It's not really indirect speech because nolo erunt is not a verb of saying or thinking. It's kind of a verb of thinking or feeling because it expresses a wish, but it's not exactly what we would call indirect speech. You might just refer to this as an accusative plus infinitive construction. And in fact, you could think of Germanos in Gallia esse as a noun clause, acting as a direct object. In Gallia means in Gaul. So number 2 says, they did not want the Germans to be in Gaul. Okay, so the point we're learning here in 487 is that with volo, nolo, or malo, you can have just an infinitive, or you can have a full accusative plus infinitive construction. You can do either one. So keep your eyes out for both of those constructions. Moving on now to section 488, here we have a fairly substantial thing that we have to talk about. It's called conditionals. And conditionals are extremely common in everyday speech. Generally speaking, they involve the word if, and so it's statements like, if you give me some money, I will go to the store. So it's really a two-part kind of sentence. You have the if part at the beginning, and then after that, you have the part that may or may not follow. It may or may not happen, depending on if the conditions of the first part are met. That's why it's called a conditional. The second part of the sentence happens on the condition that the first part of the sentence happens. Okay, so we say this kind of thing all the time. If Fred quits his job at the coffee shop, he will not be able to afford a new car. If Sheila remembers to bring the ice cream, then we can all have dessert. If you get a cat, you will have hair all over your clothes. Okay, so we have lots of examples in everyday speech of conditionals. And interestingly, each part of a conditional has a special name. The first part, that is the part that has the word if attached to it, that part is called the protasis. Some people pronounce it protasis. It doesn't really matter how you say it. In section 448, they have an example sentence. They say, if he tries, he will succeed. And so what they call it is condition. They say, if he tries is the condition. He will succeed. They're calling that the conclusion. In a more modern textbook, the terms they would give you are protasis for the first one, the if he tries part, and then the second part, he will succeed. That part is called the apodosis. Protasis and apodosis are words that come to us from Greek roots. The word protasis has to do with putting something first, and then the word apodosis has to do with something coming from something. Okay, so we have the protasis and the apodosis. And so let's move on now to section 489, and let's take a look at the mechanics of how this kind of statement works in Latin. They've divided it into three parts. They have present condition, past condition, and future condition. And different textbooks will present it different ways. A more modern textbook today might use some slightly different names, but the concepts are still the same. And what I would like you to notice, first of all, is that within each kind, we have two sub-varieties. For example, under Roman numeral heading 1, present condition, it says 1, stated as fact, and then 2, contrary to fact. Same thing for a past condition. One kind is stated as a fact, the other is contrary to fact. Number 3, a future condition. We have a more probable and a less probable. And what I want you to notice is that in each case, the one that is more factual or more probable uses the indicative, and the one that is contrary to fact or less probable is stated with the subjunctive. I've mentioned several times that the indicative mood in Latin is more associated with certainty, and the subjunctive mood is more associated with uncertainty. And here is yet another place when you see that reflected. So the indicative mood is associated with certainty and real action. The subjunctive is associated with uncertainty or unreal action. Let's take a look at these individual cases and see how this plays out. Again, Roman numeral heading 1, present condition. And then number 1 in that section, it says stated as fact. In some textbooks, they'll call this a simple present condition or something like that. And it uses the indicative. The example they give, if he is coming, it is well. Si venit, bene est. It's just a simple condition, and it's using the indicative mood. But then number 2 presents that same kind of thing, but you're saying it with the knowledge that it's not true. The idea is, if he were coming, even though we know he's not coming, but if he were coming, it would be well, or it would be good. So that's why they call it contrary to fact, is because as you say it, you know it's not true. You're just sort of hypothesizing or saying what could have happened. And in order to express something like that, you'll use the subjunctive. Why? Because the subjunctive is the mood that is associated with uncertainty and unreal action. It's not factual, it's contrary to fact, so it's not real action. So to make a statement like that, we use the imperfect subjunctive. For the verb venio, we'll take venire, which is the present infinitive, and then we'll add endings to that. That gives us the imperfect subjunctive. So, si veniret, if he should come, bene esset, it would be good, or it would be well. The idea, again, is that it's not really happening, we're just saying what might have been. If he were coming, we know he's not coming, but if he were, that would be great. That's basically what it's saying. So this present tense, contrary to fact, conditional has the subjunctive mood in both the protasis and in the apodosis. So the one that's more factual gets the indicative, the one that's contrary to fact gets the subjunctive. That's the pattern I really want you to see here. Roman numeral heading 2, past condition. Number 1 says stated as fact. In some Latin textbooks, they'll call this a past simple or simple past condition. Notice that it uses the indicative, si venit, bene fuit. So we have perfect tense verbs here that are indicative. If he came, it was well. That's kind of a strange statement to make. Probably not the most common thing you might say in a conversation. Nevertheless, we're just studying how to say that kind of thing. Again, we have indicative verbs involved with this simple past conditional. But if we want to say that same kind of thing with the knowledge that it did not happen and it's contrary to fact, then we would use the subjunctive. And in fact, the pluperfect subjunctive, so we'll take the perfect tense infinitive, that's venisse, and we'll add an ending to it. So si venisset, if he had come. We know he didn't actually come, but if he had come, that's a si venisset. And then we'll take the perfect tense infinitive of sum and say fuisse, and we'll add endings to that, and that gives us the pluperfect subjunctive. So si venisset, bene fuisset. If he had come, he actually did not come, but if he had come, it would have been well, or it would have been good. Again, the indicative has more of a factual, real feeling to it, and the subjunctive has more of an unreal, contrary to fact kind of feeling. It's talking about unreal action. That's an important point to notice. Finally, we have the future condition, and we have two flavors of the future condition. In this textbook, they call them, under number 1, more probable, and number 2, less probable. In a more modern Latin textbook, those would have different names. They would call them future more vivid and future less vivid. So instead of probable, think of the word vivid. And why would number 1 be considered future more vivid? Because it involves the indicative mood. It's got more of a feeling of certainty and realness to it. If he comes, it will be well. And so in Latin, by using the indicative to say that, it gives it more of a feeling of sureness or certainty. So si veniet, bene erit. Veniet is just a simple future tense. Remember that in Latin, there is no such thing as a future subjunctive, as far as just conjugated verbs go. Keep in mind that the future already has a certain element of uncertainty built into it, because it hasn't happened yet. And so from what I've read in books, they say that the future, because it's already uncertain, doesn't need to have additional uncertainty added to it by having a subjunctive. And in fact, when you talk in the subjunctive in Latin, it has oftentimes a feeling of talking about things that will happen in the future anyway. So si veniet, bene erit. Those are both future indicative forms. They have to be future indicative if they're future, because as far as conjugated verbs go, we don't have a future tense that is inherently subjunctive. So that's called a future more vivid. Now let's compare that to number 2, what we call future less vivid. Here in this textbook, they call it less probable. That's okay, just substitute the word vivid for the word probable. This is often referred to as a should've, would've, could've kind of conditional. Teachers call this the should-would kind of conditional. And in fact, it's written right there on the same line as less probable. Again, you're not talking about real action. You're talking about action that should happen, would happen, could happen. And that's why you get the subjunctive mood here, because the subjunctive, again, is associated with unreal action and uncertainty. So we have si veniat, that's present tense subjunctive. If he should come, the subjunctive mood there indicates a feeling of uncertainty. If he should come, bene sit, it would be good or it would be well. Again, sit is third person singular subjunctive. It's just like est, but subjunctive. Remember those present tense subjunctive forms of sum, sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. So both of these, veniat and sit, both are present subjunctive, but it's really talking about something that feels like it's in the future. So this is called a future less vivid. And again, the difference is that the future more vivid uses the indicative. It's got more of a feeling of certainty. The future less vivid uses the subjunctive and has more of a feeling of hypothesizing or wishing or just dreaming about what could have been. By the way, if it makes you feel any better, conditions in ancient Greek are far more complicated than this. This is relatively simple compared to Greek. But if I could simply point out one thing that will help you the most, it would be to think about the certainty communicated by the indicative and the uncertainty or unrealness communicated by the subjunctive. Let that be a guiding principle that carries you along through this. Let's go on now to section 490. That's our translation exercise section for this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And then when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework here in section 490. Let's go over these exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, see Walt. In these exercises, they're just giving us a few short little sentence fragments, I suppose, to practice with. They're not really full conditionals. So in number 1, see means if, and then Walt is third person singular, present tense of the verb volo, which means to want or wish. So Walt by itself means he, she, or it wants, or he, she, or it wishes. Put it together and it would say, if he wishes, if he wants, if she wants, if it wants. In later Latin, that is in the Augustan age or Golden Age, this would be spelled V-U-L-T, Walt. Number 2 is next, see woluit. Woluit is a perfect tense form of volo. It's third person singular. So it means he, she, or it wanted. So number 2 says if he wanted, if she wanted, or if it wanted. Number 3 is next, see wolet. Here, wolet is future tense. That's third person singular future of the verb volo. So the idea is if he, she, or it will want. In number 4, see again means if, and then welet is a form of volo. That's third person singular present tense subjunctive. So we could translate it as something like if he should want, if she should want, if it should want. We can put the word should or perhaps would into the translation to help communicate the uncertainty of the subjunctive mood. Same thing in number 5, see welet. Welet is imperfect subjunctive, third person singular. We could translate it as if he wanted, if she wanted, if it wanted. A similar exercise in number 6, see woluisset. The difference here is that woluisset is pluperfect, so we can use the word had and say if he, she, or it had wanted. Here in number 7, we're starting to get more complete thoughts. Number 7 says, putot eos vele. Here we have the verb puto, which means to think in the sense of suppose, and then we'll have indirect discourse after that. So putot says he, she, or it thinks, and then we throw in the word that because we're going into indirect speech. Eos is the subject accusative, and vele is the infinitive verb. Of course, eos is accusative plural, masculine, of the pronoun is, ea, id. So we could translate it as these people, those people. It's probably referring to people. And then vele is the present infinitive form of volo. That means to want. But in the context of indirect speech, we'll have to render it as part of that phrase. So altogether, it says something like, he, she, or it thinks that they want. Putot is present tense. Vele is present tense. So the whole thing just stays in the present tense. We don't need to change anything beyond just the present tense. Number 8 is next. Putot eos woluisse. Again, putot says he, she, or it thinks. Eos means something like they. Again, that's a form of is, ea, id. It's a subject accusative as we go into indirect speech. Woluisse is a perfect tense infinitive. Remember that in an indirect statement, the tense of the infinitive is relative to the tense of the main verb. Putot, the main verb, is present. Woluisse is perfect, so we need to render our translation in such a way where the activity of woluisse is happening in time before the timing of putat, before that activity happens. So let's try, he, she, or it thinks that they wanted. So compare 7 and 8. 7 says, he, she, or it thinks that they want. That's a present infinitive. Number 8 says, he, she, or it thinks that they wanted, because that's a perfect tense infinitive. So a good comparison there for learning purposes. Number 9 is next. Non est dubium quin voluerit. The first 3 words here, non est dubium, together we'll say something like, there is no doubt. The word dubium could be a noun that means a doubt. So this could say, there is not a doubt. Non est, in the sense of there is not a doubt. Or it could be more of an impersonal kind of statement. The word dubium could be a neuter adjective that means doubtful. So it could be impersonal, saying, it is not doubtful. Either way, it means the same thing. And then queen means something like, but that. In a queen clause, you need a subjunctive verb. And so that's what we have with voluerit. That's a perfect tense subjunctive. At first glance, it looks like a future perfect, but really it's subjunctive because it's inside of a queen clause. So we could translate number 9 as, there is no doubt but that he, she, or it wanted. Or perhaps slightly smoother, there is no doubt that he, she, or it wanted. Number 10 is next. Nolumus. It's just one word. That's a form of the verb nolo, which means to not want something. It's present tense, first person plural, so it means we do not want. In number 11, we have the same verb, except pluperfect. Noluerant says, they had not wanted. If it were perfect tense, it would be noluerunt with a U, but with noluerant, it's pluperfect. Number 12 is next. Si nolitus. Si means if, and nolitus is a form of nolo. It's second person plural, present tense. So it means y'all do not want, but also it's subjunctive. If it were indicative, it would say non vultus, or as they have in this book, non vultus with an O. But here it's subjunctive, so it's nolitus. So number 12 might say something like, if y'all do not want. If you were to see this sentence in an actual text, you might throw in a direct object, saying something like, if y'all don't want it. You would just need to look at the context. Next we have number 13, si nolatus. Again, si means if, and nolatus is an imperfect subjunctive form of nolo. If you take away the tis, you get nole, which is the present infinitive. So we could say something like, if y'all did not want. Again, without any context, it's hard to figure out good ways to translate these things. We're just translating these as best we can for practice. Really, we're just trying to identify the forms of the verbs. Number 14 is next. Si noluisatis. Here you can see that noluisatis is a pluperfect subjunctive form of nolo. If you take away the tis from the end, you get noluisse, which is the perfect tense infinitive. If you take the perfect tense infinitive and then add endings to it, you get the pluperfect subjunctive. So for number 14, again, that's pluperfect. So we could say, if y'all had not wanted. Number 15 is next. Sunt qui ire nolent. As I've said before, when verbs like est or sunt come first in a sentence, you can often translate them with the word there. There is, there are, there were, there will be. So here, sunt coming first, that makes me want to translate it as there are. Then we have a relative clause starting with qui, and notice that this relative clause contains a subjunctive verb. That's an important detail. Nolent is a form of nolo. It's present tense, third person plural, subjunctive. So it means they don't want, but it's subjunctive. So it says, there are qui ire nolent. Qui would mean who. We don't really have a good antecedent here. We don't have anything that qui is directly referring back to. There just simply is not an antecedent. So we could translate qui as those who to fill it out a little bit. And then ire means to go. That's the present tense infinitive, active infinitive of the verb eo, which means go. So put it all together. There are those who do not want to go. And since nolent is subjunctive, we have to take that into account. Could this be a relative clause of purpose? There are those for the purpose of don't want to go? No, that doesn't make any sense at all. Plus, grammar books will tell you that with a relative clause of purpose, you need to have a strongly stated or an obviously stated antecedent, a clear antecedent, which we do not have here. So, what this probably is a relative clause of characteristic. It's saying there are those who do not want to go in the sense of there are people out there who are the kind of people who do not want to go. Instead of referring to some specific people and saying, hey, see those people over there? They don't want to go. And so because they're standing over there, I can say that there are those who do not want to go. If I were to say it like that, I would probably want to use an indicative verb. So that would be saying there are actual people, specific people I have in mind who don't want to go. That would have an indicative verb. But here, it's a relative clause of characteristic. I'm just saying, there are people out there who are the kind of people who don't want to go. I might not have anyone specific in mind, but I know that there's somebody out there who thinks that. So that's what we have here in number 15. There are those, meaning the kind of people who do not want to go. It's a relative clause of characteristic. And yet again, this is another example of how the indicative mood is associated with certainty and real action, and the subjunctive mood is associated with uncertainty and unreal situations and actions. That's a big theme I'm trying to get you to absorb in this particular lesson. Number 16 is next. Si transire conantur. The verb conor, which means to try, is first conjugation. So here, conantur is not subjunctive. That's just an indicative verb. Remember that conor is deponent. So si plus conantur would say if they try, and then transire means to cross. So number 16 says, if they try to cross. Number 17 is next. Si conintur. Now here we have the same verb form as in 16, except it's subjunctive. Notice how the letter A has changed into the letter E. So instead of conantur, we have conintur. So number 17 says, if they should try. Number 18 is next. Si conati essent. Again, conor is a deponent verb. So it looks passive, but it's really active. So conati is a perfect tense participle. In this case, it's a perfect active participle because it's the perfect participle of a deponent verb. When paired with an imperfect subjunctive like this, we get a pluperfect subjunctive. So it means if they had tried. Essent is the infinitive esse plus endings. So by itself, essent is an imperfect subjunctive. But then, paired along with konati, together they join forces and form a pluperfect subjunctive. So number 18 says, if they had tried, literally, if they were in the past in a state of having tried. So essent takes you one step into the past, and then konati, being a perfect tense participle, that takes you another step into the past because it's someone in a state of already having done a thing. So when this compound tense takes you two steps into the past like that, it's pluperfect. So if they had tried. Number 19 is next. Here's a complete sentence. Si transire conabuntur, eos prohibebit. Here we have conabuntur, which is future tense. It's third person plural, so it says they will try. And then along with si, it says if they will try, meaning in the future. So if they will in the future try, transire, to cross. We have a footnote here, footnote number 1. Let's see what it says. It says the English generally uses the present in a future more probable condition, though the Latin requires the future. So in English, we would say the present tense here. We would say, if they try to cross, but in Latin, you have to put it in the future to make a future more vivid. So literally in Latin, it's if they will try to cross, but in English, we would just say a present tense verb, if they try to cross. So really, this exercise here is our first true, full conditional sentence that we're translating. And as the footnote just told us, they kind of gave it away that this is a future more vivid, or as they call it, future more probable. So the protasis is si transire conabuntur, and then eos prohibebit is the apodosis. So the apodosis says prohibebit, he, she, or it will prevent, he, she, or it will stop, he, she, or it will keep them back, something like that. Let's try prevent. Let's translate prohibebit as he, she, or it will prevent. And then eos is the direct object. That means them. That's a form of is, ea, id. So we have a full conditional sentence here in number 19. Si transire conabuntur, if they will try to cross, or simply, if they try to cross, he, she, or it will prevent them. Notice that both conabuntur and prohibebit are indicative. So if you look back up at section 489, Roman numeral 3, let's review. It says, more probable, that's number 1 there, more probable future or future perfect indicative. So we have indicative verbs here, and for the protasis, you have your choice of future or future perfect. That's what the authors of the book were telling us in the footnote a moment ago, that in Latin, you have to use the future or future perfect if you want to make a future more vivid conditional sentence. So that's why both conabuntur and prohibebit are both future tense. In number 20, we have yet another complete conditional sentence with both a protasis and apodosis. Let's read it. Si obsides ab eis dentur, cum eis pacem faciat. In the protasis, we have si obsides ab eis dentur. Notice that dentur is a form of the verb do, which means give. Dentur is third person plural, it's passive, it's present tense, and it's subjunctive. If it were indicative, it would be dantur, but here it's subjunctive, so we have dentur. Si means if, and obsides means hostages. So it says, if hostages should be given, and then ab eis is an ablative of agent. That's showing by whom the passive activity is performed. We don't know who the they is, or them. Eis is just a form of isea id, referring to some group. So if hostages should be given, or if hostages are given by them, that's the protasis. And now the apodosis says, cum eis pacem faciat. Faciat is another present tense subjunctive. That's the verb facio. So faciat will say he, she, or it makes, or he, she, or it does, but it's subjunctive. And pacem is the direct object. That means peace. It's in the accusative singular. Cum eis means with them. So number 20 says, if hostages are given by them, he, she, or it will make peace with them. If you take a look back up in section 489, Roman numeral 3, where it says future condition, you'll find that this is, number 2, a future less probable, or as we would call it in a more modern textbook, a future less vivid. This is the should-would kind of conditional. So you can translate the protasis with should and the apodosis with would. If hostages should be given by them, he would make peace with them. Future less vivid. That's what that's called. Moving on to number 21. Si proilio contendere voluisset, vicisset. Again, si means if. Voluisset is a form of volo. Voluisse is the perfect tense infinitive. So if you add endings to that, you get the pluperfect subjunctive. So si plus voluisset says, if he, she, or it had wanted, and then contendere means to strive, fight, or hasten, and proilio means in battle. That's the second declension noun proilium, which means battle. It's ablative singular. So the protasis says, if he, she, or it had wanted to strive or fight in battle, and then the apodosis of this conditional is vicisset. That's a form of the verb vinco, V-I-N-C-O, which means to conquer, subdue, to be victorious. This is pluperfect subjunctive. Vicisse is the perfect tense infinitive of vinco. If we take the perfect tense infinitive, vicisse, and we add endings to it, we get a pluperfect subjunctive. And so that's what we have here. So vicisset says something like, he, she, or it would have won. So number 21 says, if he, she, or it had wanted to fight in battle, he, she, or it would have won. In the context of the Roman army, this would have to be talking about a man, so we can just throw in the word he as our pronoun subject and say, if he had wanted to fight in battle, he would have won. Looking back up at section 49, Roman numeral 2, you can see that this is variety 2. It's a past contrary to fact conditional. You can tell because it's got a pluperfect subjunctive in both protasis and apodosis. So the idea with number 21 is, if he had wanted to fight in battle, he didn't want to fight in battle, but if he had wanted to fight in battle, he would have won. So you're speaking in a way that's contrary to what actually happened. Therefore, the idea of contrary to fact. Number 22 is next. Si facultas detur ab maleficio non temperent. Our protasis is si facultas detur. Facultas means opportunity, and detur is a form of the verb do, which means give. This is third person singular, present tense. It's passive, and it's subjunctive. So the protasis says something like, if an opportunity should be given. And then the apodosis says, ab maleficio non temperent. Tempero means to refrain. And so here we have imperfect subjunctive, meaning they would not refrain, non temperent. They would not refrain, ab maleficio, from mischief. Now you may be asking yourself the question, what kind of condition is this? Detur is present tense, but temperent is imperfect tense. I think if you want to analyze this kind of conditional, you could call it a mixed condition. The protasis makes it look like it's going to be a future less vivid because it's got a present subjunctive. But then in the apodosis, you have an imperfect subjunctive, which makes it look more like a present contrary to fact. So it doesn't really match the kinds of examples they gave us. And so if you see this out in the wild, if you see this in a text, you could call that a mixed conditional. But the basic meaning of it is, if an opportunity should be given, they would not refrain from mischief. We have a footnote here that poses a good question. The footnote says, how else can this condition be expressed? Okay, so in number 22, the protasis says, si facultas detur. If an opportunity should be given, how else could we say that in Latin? Well, I can think of one way. We could use an ablative absolute. Let's give it a try. First of all, we'll need a perfect tense participle form of the verb do. So what are the four principal parts? Do, dare, dedi, datum. So datus, data, datum means having been given or just given. And facultas is a third declension feminine noun. So if we wanted to put it in the ablative singular, it would be facultate. And since it's feminine, we would need a feminine ablative singular form of datus, data, datum to go with it. So that would give us data with a macron over the A, the last A there, D-A-T, long A. So if we say facultate data, that would mean with an opportunity having been given. And in the context of a condition, it really would have the feeling of if along with it. So in number 22, if it's in a condition like that, it would say this, facultate data ab maleficio non temperent. And we would translate that as, if the opportunity were given, they would not refrain from mischief. And when you're reading texts, you'll see that kind of thing. You'll see a conditional in which one part of the condition has been converted to some other grammatical structure. And so you have to take that into consideration and read it in context. Let's move on now to section 492. That's our reading from Caesar's Gallic Wars for this lesson. Let's take a look at the first two lines up through the word respondit. Tamen ut spatium intercedere posset, dum milites quos imperaverat convenirent, legatis respondit. We have lots of moving parts here, so let's take it one step at a time, and let's look at tamen, and then on line 2, legatis and respondit. Tamen means something like yet, nevertheless, or still. And then respondit on line 2 is perfect tense, and it says he, she, or it responded. Legatis is dative plural. That's the word that means envoys, ambassadors. Sometimes it can mean a high-ranking general, depending on the context. Here it means ambassadors. So tamen, legatis, and respondit, those three words will say, nevertheless, he responded to the ambassadors. So this is Julius Caesar talking. He is responding to the Helvetian ambassadors who have requested permission to take a shortcut across Roman territory. As we will find out soon enough, he is a deft strategist. I would not want to play chess against Julius Caesar. So nevertheless, he responded to the ambassadors. Now, within that, we have a couple of other things happening. First of all, we have a purpose clause, starting with the word ut, and then the subject of the purpose clause is spatium. Spatium is a second declension noun. It's neuter. It means space, or it can mean a space of time, an interval of time. Let's just keep it simple and translate it as a space of time. Within this purpose clause, we need a subjunctive verb, and that's posset. So ut, spatium, and posset together will say, so that a space of time might be able. Posset is imperfect subjunctive, and it's got a complementary infinitive, intercedere. That's the verb cedo, C-E-D-O, prefixed with the preposition inter. Inter means between or among. Cedo means go or move or yield. So literally, intercedo means to go between. We get our English word intercede, also words like intercessory. If you intercede on someone's behalf, it means you're sort of entering into a situation, going in between two parties. Sometimes you'll hear this word used to intercede on someone's behalf. So ut spatium intercedere posset will say, so that a space of time might be able to, or could, we could say the word could, so that a space of time could intercede or intervene. What's happening here is Julius Caesar is trying to buy some time. He's trying to delay the Helvetii to buy time so he can make military preparations. Then we have a temporal clause, dum milites quos imperaverat convenierent. Dum means while, milites means soldiers, and convenierent, that's, again, imperfect subjunctive. So it's saying while the soldiers might be able to gather. What soldiers? Well, we have a relative clause here, quos imperaverat. Quos is a relative pronoun, starting a relative clause. It's masculine and plural because its antecedent, milites, is masculine and plural, but it's accusative because of the role it plays within the relative clause. It's the direct object of imperaverat. So let's back up and read the whole thing. Here's what it says literally. Nevertheless, so that a space of time might be able to intervene while the soldiers whom he had commanded might gather, he responded to the ambassadors. So we have several layers of things happening here. We have a main clause with tamen, legatis, and respondit, and then embedded within that we have a purpose clause, ut, spatium, blah, blah, blah. And then dum milites, starting from there, it's a temporal clause with a subjunctive verb. It's kind of part of the purpose clause. It's really attached to the purpose clause. I'm reading it as part of the purpose clause. So you could think of the temporal clause as being within the purpose clause, and then within the temporal clause, you have a relative clause. So it's like the layers of an onion. You have the outer layer, peel that away, and there's another layer. Peel that away, and there's another layer. So with quos imperaverat, we're really 4 layers deep inside this sentence. Main clause, and then in that is a purpose clause. Inside of that is a temporal clause. Inside of that is a relative clause. The only kind of clause we don't have is Santa Claus. So this is good practice, and it's really not the easiest Latin to read. So taking it from the top one more time. Nevertheless, so that a period of time or space of time might be able to intervene while the soldiers whom he had commanded gather together, he responded to the envoys. Now keep in mind, the context here is that Caesar has done a big troop activation. He's calling up troops. He's basically drafting troops from Gallia Narbonensis, from the province, the Roman province, which is in the south part of Gaul. He's telling the local tribesmen there, who are, ethnically speaking, they're Gauls. There might be lots of Romans living there who have moved there. There could be lots of military veterans. So there could be a strong Roman cultural influence on that area, but you're also going to have outlying areas where it's just Gallic tribesmen. And so what he's doing here is a troop levy. He's telling all the Gallic tribes, the towns, the cities, he's saying, you have to supply troops for this military conflict. So he's requisitioning troops. He's calling up troops. He's activating troops. He's telling the Gallic tribesmen in that Roman province that they have to supply troops to go and fight. So the word imperaverat, which by the way is pluperfect, it doesn't necessarily just mean the soldiers whom he had commanded. It means the soldiers whom he had levied, the soldiers whom he had requisitioned, the soldiers whom he had drafted. So he puts out a notice saying that the Gallic tribesmen in that province have to contribute troops, and now he needs time for all those troops to show up. He needs time for all those troops to get together and get ready to fight. It doesn't happen overnight, and so he's trying to buy some time and delay things. He wants to slow things down. He's already decided that the answer is no. He already knows that he's going to deny their request. He's just feeding them really a delaying tactic. And so the verb respondit, that's a verb of speaking, and so that can start off some indirect speech. And so after that, starting with diem, se, ad deliberandum, all that is indirect discourse. Anytime you have indirect discourse, you need to have a subject accusative, and then you need to have an infinitive to be the verb. It's an accusative plus infinitive construction. So se here is the subject. It's a reflexive pronoun in the accusative singular, referring back to Caesar. So he responded to the ambassadors that he, and then sumpturum, you need to supply the word esse to remind yourself that that's really an infinitive. So sumpturum esse is a future active infinitive that says he will take, literally to be about to take, but in indirect discourse, we'll translate it as he will take. And sumpturum is accusative because it needs to agree with se. That's a masculine accusative singular participle. It's a future active participle of the verb sumo, which means to take. So respondit, se, sumpturum, and a supplied esse. Those four words will say he responded that he would take, or that he was going to take, future active infinitive, sumpturum plus esse, and that's the infinitive that is the verb in this indirect statement. So he responded to the ambassadors that he was going to take, and then diem is the direct object of sumpturum esse. As you can see from the footnote, they want us to translate it as time. Really, literally, it means a day. So he responded to the ambassadors that he would take a day. Or as they would like us to translate it, he responded to the ambassadors that he was going to take time. Ad deliberandum is a gerund expressing purpose. Ad means for the purpose of. Deliberandum means deliberating. So the whole thing says, he responded to the ambassadors that he was going to take time for the purpose of deliberating. And then finally, we have a conditional sentence starting with C. Si quid velint, ad idos apriles reverterentur. We have lots of footnotes here. Let's take a look at what these footnotes are telling us. We have footnotes 8, 9, 10. There's also footnote 2. I'm not sure why they put them out of order like that, but footnote 2 about eidos, that's talking about the ides. Sometimes it's the 13th, sometimes it's the 15th of the month. That's one of the ways that the ancient Romans would determine dates. Footnote 8 is really good. It's talking about quid. Quid here is an indefinite that means anything. So with words like quis or quid, they become indefinite when they follow certain words. Words like si. So you can read quid here as if it's aliquid. So quid means what or something like that. But if it's aliquid, it means something. So it's an indefinite. And there's a little mnemonic you can use to remember this. It says, after si, nisi, num, or ne, all the alis fly away. So if this were si aliquid, the ali, the ali in aliquid, that makes it indefinite, that flies away. Si quid means if anything. Again, after si, the word quid becomes indefinite and turns into aliquid, which means anything. So si quid and velint together, by the way, velint is volo in the imperfect subjunctive. It says, if they should want anything, basically it's the protasis of a conditional. If they should want anything, and then reverterentur, that's the verb reverto, which literally means to turn back. So basically it means to return. And then ad idos apriles says at the ides of April, which I believe means the 13th of April. There's a good footnote about reverto. That's footnote 10. Notice that reverterentur is passive, or it looks passive, but the footnote says that in the present tense, it's deponent. So it's really not reverto, it's revertor, a deponent verb. So this last part here, the conditional part, it says, if they should want anything, they should return at the ides of April. Furthermore, according to footnote 9, velint is imperfect subjunctive, not because of the way the conditional is set up, but because it's being quoted. Honestly, I don't know what that means. I don't know who he would be quoting it from, because Julius Caesar is the author of the text. Maybe it's a reference to the fact that the Helvetii are the ones saying that they want something, and so he's, in a sense, quoting the idea that they want something. I'm not fully clear on that. It looks like a present contrary to fact condition, but that doesn't really fit the context. So let's go along with what the footnote is saying, that it's imperfect subjunctive because it's being quoted. So let's read this last part all together, starting with legatis. He responded to the ambassadors that he was going to take time for the purpose of deliberating. If they should want anything, they should return at the ides of April. Okay, so Julius Caesar is telling the Helvetian ambassadors that he's going to take some time to think it over. Is he really going to take some time to think it over? No, he's lying, and he has no intention of allowing them to come through Roman territory. He's telling them that he's going to take some time to think it over as a delaying tactic. It's just a lie to allow him to buy time. So he says, go away and come back later and I'll give you my decision. And then, while they're waiting for his decision, he's making furious, military preparations. So this is a delaying tactic that he's using to buy time to allow him to gather up all the troops that he has levied and requisitioned from the local Gallic tribes who live in the Roman province. He's trying desperately to get all the military troops he needs to prevent the Helvetii from coming into Roman territory. Because as we learned before, there is a huge number of Helvetians. I think they said there was 110,000. He's only got about 5,000 troops or less. So he's enormously outnumbered by the Helvetii, and therefore he's trying desperately to gather troops. So he tells the Helvetii that he's going to think it over and come back later for his decision. Well, that brings us to the end of yet another episode of Lenny's Latin class. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next time in Lesson 63.